Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents George Washington, The Wonder of the Age, by John Rhodehamel, narrated by Joe Barrett. 1. Look around you. George Washington never took much interest in his ancestors. When he was an old man and the new president of the new United States of America, he would reply politely to an aristocratic English genealogist who had written for help in tracing the Washington family tree. Courtesy, however, did not disguise Washington's pointed little lecture on the promise of the great experiment then underway in America. For the Americans had set out to create a new society, one guided by the faith that a person's rank should be grounded on attainment rather than ancestry, by the faith that all people were created equal. His own ancestry was a subject, President Washington wrote the genealogist, to which I confess I have paid very little attention. My time has been so much occupied in the busy and active scenes of life from an early period of it, that but a small portion of it could have been devoted to researches of this nature. We have no office of record in this country in which exact genealogical documents are preserved, and very few cases, I believe, occur where a recurrence to pedigree for any considerable distance back has been found necessary to establish such points as may frequently arise in older countries. Washington's subtext might have read, "In Republican society, people, though born equal, still sought the honors supplied elsewhere by the trappings of aristocracy. A kind of Republican peerage might exist, but entry into its ranks did not require fortunate birth, but rather demonstrated talent, ambition, and a virtuous devotion to the public good." Washington had been too busy winning honor to study his lineage. So much honor did he win that His Excellency General George Washington may seem an unlikely champion of the revolutionary principle that all people are created equal. In death as in life, Americans have revered Washington as a mythic figure, remote in his icy majesty. We cannot forget that he was the master of 300 slaves. He was commander of officers and men in their thousands. The Generalissimo awarded quasi-dictatorial powers by the Continental Congress in 1776. He was a consummate political actor who became America's first elected head of state. Washington was also a high-living Virginia gentleman, possessed of vast tracts of land and of all the luxuries wealth could command. He was an authentic classical hero, the American Cincinnatus, said to have countless admirers but not a single friend. He was a proud but insecure man who could confuse dissent with disloyalty. Yet this same George Washington was a revolutionary, for a quarter-century the central figure in a radical revolution that aimed at nothing less than the transformation of Western civilization. When Washington was born in 1732, the British colonies in North America were obscure and inconsequential outposts. The courts of Europe had long been the focus of the Atlantic world. All the principal European states were ruled by hereditary monarchs, kings and queens, emperors and czars, who reigned by virtue of their carefully recorded pedigrees. In Britain, the king was constrained by a constitution that compelled him to govern with the consent of Parliament. But even in England, the king was the unquestioned head of state. Just beneath royalty revolved the glittering constellations of aristocracy, proud lords and high-born ladies. They, too, were exalted by birth far above the common run of men and women. Government by birth appeared the most satisfactory model for ordering society, one that had prevailed for centuries and promised to persist into the remote future. When Washington died in 1799, the 18th century was coming to a close, while the age of hereditary power, the very notion of government by birth, had been started down the road to extinction. And the United States of America, overleaping its small beginnings on the margins of European civilization, would one day thrust itself into the forefront of world history. The little republic would become a gigantic continental democracy, a nation unlike any that had come before. The promise of equality may never be realized. Nevertheless, the American Revolution made the theory of popular government a reality for the first time, furnishing a compelling alternative to the ancient tyranny of kings. American success marked a fundamental turning point in human affairs. That success may have been out of reach without Washington's leadership. Of course, George Washington did not make the revolution. It was the work of the American people. The man who described himself as a figure upon the stage in the greater drama now acting on this theater emerged as a flawless performer, taking his cues from his audience, the people themselves. Although many Americans were shut out of the political process, participation by white men was widespread. They could draw on ideals born in the classical republics of antiquity. Many had studied the political theorists of the Enlightenment. They took pride in the venerable Constitution of Britain itself. The set of traditions that Britons and their British-American cousins boasted made England the most free nation on earth. The Americans drew as well on their own unique heritage as inhabitants of fluid, quasi-republican colonial societies. Still, at every stage of the drama, George Washington played the leading role. Thomas Jefferson supposed that to Washington belonged the singular destiny and merit of leading the armies of his country successfully through an arduous war for the establishment of its independence, of conducting its councils through the birth of a government, new in forms and principles, until it settled down into a quiet and orderly train, and of scrupulously obeying the laws through the whole of his career, civil and military, of which the history of the world furnishes no other example. Revolution is a perilous enterprise. You have a republic, but only if you can keep it, Benjamin Franklin had warned after the delegates signed the new Constitution in 1787. Would it prove, as philosophers predicted and history had confirmed, that the Republican government demanded by the principle of equality could never provide the bonds of power needed to hold together a large and diverse nation? Was it inevitable that in a few years or decades the United States would be forced to abandon popular representation and resort to despotism? Would the infant republic fragment into a set of squabbling petty sovereignties? We know the outcome of the experiment. Those living through its early years could not. But they did understand what was at risk. They were contending for what Washington called a blessing to millions yet unborn. No one felt the gamble more keenly than he did. The sacred fire of liberty and the destiny of the Republican model of government is staked on the experiment and trusted to the hands of the American people, he declared at his first inauguration in 1789. Jefferson remembered, years after the older man's death, that Washington had often declared to me that he considered our new Constitution as an experiment on the practicability of Republican government, and with what dose of liberty man could be trusted for his own good, that he was determined the experiment should have a fair trial and would lose the last drop of his blood in support of it. It was not Washington's blood, however, but his enormous prestige, the trust Americans held for him, that had carried the experiment safely through so many hazards. He had won that trust in the Revolution. He had won it, most of all, by the extraordinary act of resigning his command at the end of the war. General Washington had led the American states to independent nationhood through 8.5 years of war and diplomacy. But history had seen many victorious generals, many Caesars and Cromwells. What set this general apart was the way that, when the war was over, he willingly, even eagerly, gave up power to return to Mount Vernon as a private citizen in 1783. The astonishing renunciation deeply impressed the entire Western world, as Washington had surely known it would. In Europe as well as America, George Washington was widely regarded as the greatest man alive, the shining Republican hero. In an age that believed power corrupted its possessors, Washington was the wonder of the age. Revolutions have a way of going bad. Tyrants are often supplanted by other tyrants. The greatest revolution of the 18th century broke out in Paris in 1789, the year Washington became president. 15 years later, the French Revolution succeeded in replacing a king with an emperor when Napoleon Bonaparte crowned himself in 1804. In America, the outcome had been different. Jefferson concluded that the moderation and virtue of a single character has probably prevented this revolution from being closed as most others have been, by a subversion of that liberty it was intended to establish. Washington called the American Revolution the last great experiment for promoting human happiness. He was wrong.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?